Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of Polyglot Nation, the series in which we discuss with South Africans the unique languages they speak. Today's guest is someone I've been eager to have on ever since I met her, Ruth. Ruth Michael. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. There's been some
You did.
off-screen, yeah,
Perfect. On spot.
been some off-screen training in that regard. Um, Ruth, everyone that we've interviewed so far, or almost everyone that we've interviewed so far, has speaks a language that represents a certain diaspora in South Africa, and you are no exception. Would you mind introducing yourself to us and the very interesting language you speak?
Okay. Okay, as you said, my name is Ruth Michael, and I was born in South Africa, but my parents are originally from Ethiopia. So I speak Amharic. Although in my house, my mom does also speak Tigrinya. Amharic it's more of like a first additional language for me rather than like a home language because I was born and raised in South Africa. So I only started learning it towards like my early teenage years.
Oh, fascinating! But you speak Amharic fluently, and you converse with the
Yes, now I can speak, read, although my reading skills aren't as great because like Amharic has its own alphabet. So but I can speak, read, write, and Amharic like fluently, somewhat fluently.
I think that yeah, that's one of the reasons I've been so eager to have you on is I just think it's one of the coolest things I've ever heard. Uh, so um, there are so many questions I actually have right now, but of course, for elaboration, Amharic is the official language of Ethiopia, correct? And
Yeah, yes, it is. It became the official language after Emperor Haile Selassie officialized it, so to make more constitutional things, anything relating to politics and so on, or the kingdoms and so on, simpler, I guess.
yes, exactly. And maybe perhaps before we go on, because I have a lot of interesting questions about Amharic and the script that you're speaking about. But perhaps maybe you can tell us a bit more about yourself as well. I know that you are a student at the University of the Witwatersrand.
Yes, I am. I'm studying BA Law, and this is my third year. So I'm almost done with this degree. I'm majoring in law and psychology. Um, Although I have no intentions on pursuing a career in either field, it's just like something I'm interested in.
Excellent.
So yeah. And as for Ethiopia, I've only visited Ethiopia a few times, but I've never actually lived there. So yeah.
Yes. And maybe this is a bit of a personal question. Would you ever consider living in Ethiopia?
Yes and no. No, because of the political situation right now in that country. It's not really, I wouldn't consider it as like a safe country to live in right now, but I don't know, maybe someday. We'll see.
Well, it sounds like it would. It seems it's a country I'd very much like to visit one day. Um,
It
now
is a beautiful
returning.
country and it's an amazing country to visit.
Yes, I'm
I
sure.
feel like living there and visiting would be two different like experiences. So,
Yes, I suppose that's the case with any country, right? Um, so
mhm.
yes, but now actually perhaps returning slightly to also to what you were mentioning about the script. So of course, one of the really interesting things is, of course, Ethiopian is not Amharic is not actually written in the Roman alphabet. It's written with the I can't pronounce this, so forgive my pronunciation. Ge'ez script.
It
Um,
is, yes.
yes, which of course is an ancient Ethiopian language, if I'm not mistaken.
Mhm. Yes, I mean it's still used somewhat, mostly in churches, in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church mostly, but it is pretty. It's becoming endangered.
Yes. And do you have any experience? Have you heard or interacted with gays before?
Well, my grandmother can speak it because she was raised in a very like religious household, so they spoke Ge'ez, and I guess Ge'ez is much more similar to Tigrinya, which is my mother's like main home language. Which is also one, so like Ethiopia has like about 80 to 90 languages, and
Yes.
one of
Wow.
them is Tigrinya. Amharic is the main official language of the country, but Tigrinya is also one of them, is also one of the 80 to 90 languages. So Amharic like originally somewhat came from Ge'ez, but Tigrinya is somewhat more similar. The current state of the Tigrinya language is somewhat more similar to Ge'ez than Amharic is.
Fascinating.
So my grandmother and my mother, to a certain extent, are much more. I can't say a single word in Ge'ez. I don't understand it. So, but yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating. That is very, very interesting. So, yes, I mean, I have so many questions, and maybe I think I'll start or I'll continue. It's very difficult. This is in many ways this is the most difficult interview to hold because it's I'm talking about something that's extremely interesting to me, and so I don't really know exactly where to continue from here. But maybe we'll start with the pedagogy here. You mentioned that Amharic is not something that you spoke as a first language. You acquired it in your teenage years.
Mhm.
Could you describe to us a little bit about
Yes.
that process? What was the motive? Why, firstly, why were you so interested in picking up Amharic?
Well, I mean, my entire life, like Amharic has just always been there in my life. So, like my parents, that's how my parents spoke to each other, their friends, family members, and so on. So, I mean, when I was a kid, I did understand Amharic to a certain extent, where I knew a few phrases, and I could kind of understand what my parents were talking about. But when I was around like 11 years old, I think, or 12, I was much more, I actually wanted to learn it, like actually learn the alphabet, the numbers and so on, because I could only speak it, well, barely speak it at that time. So I was just like, it just sort of dawned on me, like, I mean, I'm Ethiopian. I might as well like know the language or so, a bit more than I do right now. So I asked my dad to teach me. He was an awful teacher, but he's like started teaching me the alphabet. It did not go so well. So instead, I started to like just practice it on my own. And I think between like 12 to 16, that's when I was really more focused on studying it. And then after that, it was smooth sailing after that.
Wow. Well, that's one of the most interesting examples we've had of language acquisition among anyone that we've interviewed for this series, because most of the people that we've interviewed, they either picked up the language in an informal sense from their family to the point of to the point of fluency, or they learned the language formally. But you engage in a long process of self-study. That's something I can sympathize with in a sense. Most of the languages I speak, I learned through quite a long period of self-study. But nothing that I ever learned was as different from English as Amharic is. So there must have been a lot of challenges that you faced. Keep in mind, of course, that you aren't even operating with the Roman alphabet. So what I mean
Yeah.
in this whole process, what was really the maybe you could point to the one or two most difficult components of learning Amharic in such a individual way?
I guess the main problem that I face, and I still sometimes do, is that because my main language is English, I you can't really always translate a, an English sentence into an Amharic sentence because it's not always going to make sense. So I think starting off, that was the most challenging. And also, there were also like, so my uncle, I can't find that book right now, but my uncle, when I was 6 years old and visited Ethiopia, and everyone realized I could barely speak Amharic, he gave me a book, which is like an Amharic. Um, it was Amharic, like a teaching learning book, and alphabets. It was also kind of like a dictionary and so on. So I had that, and that was basically what I was going off of. But there were some things in that book, kind of like idioms and so on. And as I was studying it, I would ask my parents a question or something. And what I realized is Amharic is a difficult language, not just for those who don't know the language, but even for those who do. And even people that were well informed on the language, who studied the language in universities or whatever, certain things were they the way they were. So I guess those were like the two main challenges, and I just had to accept that. Okay, it's just a difficult language, and no one really understands it, but you just go along with it.
Yes, yes, and I think maybe something that's interesting to point out here for context for everyone watching. Um, Amharic is actually a Semitic language. So even though it's a language in Africa, it's a language that's actually closer related to Arabic or Hebrew than many of the languages well, than any of the languages spoken in South Africa, for example, um, and the majority of languages in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's also something that makes it tricky, I would assume,
Yeah.
is that you don't necessarily have a lot of neighboring countries on the continent that are mutually that speak languages that are mutually intelligible. So there's that kind of phenomenon of almost isolation that might make it more difficult. And then another question I think I have more specifically is the script. This is the thing that I keep going back to. Um, the script really interests me. So, did you find it really difficult to adapt to? Did you? I mean, one of the things I would think if I were to try learn Amharic, I would probably try and find a work that tries to kind of phonetically transliterate Amharic into Roman script, and then gradually start learning it with the Ge'ez script. But how did you approach that problem?
Well, that's exactly kind of like how I did. So my parents bought me this huge, kind of like a chart paper, and it had all the alphabets, and right next to it, it had like so the so it's called Get a script, but it's also called Fidel in Amharic. And so it had the Amharic's like the Get script, and then next to it in the like Roman alphabets, what it's how you pronounce it. So that's how I started off. And I don't know, I guess like the hardest part was so a part of like the feedings, there are some of them that sound the same, but they have different significances. Like some of them, if you were to use them, they're more like they lean more into like an in you only use them for words that are insults or something, and there are just certain rules to them. So I guess that was one of the problems where if I were to like construct a sentence or something, and I just had to learn when to use what which, and it just sort of it wasn't something that I learned like in a day or in a week or something. It just sort of over time I learned that okay, I can't use this out like letter for the in this context or whatever. Another is, I guess, whenever I used to write, and I still, even till this day, whenever I write in the Amharic alphabet, everyone still says to me that I look like I'm drawing something, which is how I learned the alphabet, because for me, at first, it looked like drawings. It didn't look like alphabets. So like, till this very day, every time I write something, it looks like I'm drawing. And it's like a joke in the house. So
Very, yeah, no, that's I can imagine that adapting yourself to something completely new like that, there's this kind of it must seem alien initially, and so naturally you wouldn't produce in the same with the
yes, it
same
definitely
kind of
was.
you wouldn't produce it with the same kind of as naturally as you would write in Roman script. Um, but maybe if we could take a moment and just turn back to kind of your personal connection. to the language? So you mentioned how this was always something that was in your environment and you wanted to, in some sense, participate with it more actively. Was there something particular? Was there maybe a particular incident that really caused you to want to kind of grab hold of that element of your Ethiopian identity and start participating in the language more? It's very interesting. The reason I say this is because it's very interesting how much this resonates a lot with the experience of many South Africans who perhaps come from an Italian or a Greek or a Portuguese background, and who've heard the language that that their family traditionally speaks at family gatherings, etc. But there's always like some inciting incident or some perhaps even a period of their lives in which young people decide that they actually really want to start taking up learning Italian or Greek seriously. Was there any moment like that for you? Yeah, I'm keen to hear about that.
Um, I can't remember if there was a specific reason I decided to take it up at the exact time I decided to take it up, but I do recall when I was a kid, my grandma made me cry about not being able to speak it fluently. So, and I think because I remember that day so distinctly, I feel like that might have had something to do with it.
More than likely, I think. My outside opinion. Um, okay, so that is quite a funny story there. Well, maybe it's funny in retrospect. Maybe you wouldn't have found it funny at the time. Um, you obviously speak Amharic, and when you speak with other members of the Ethiopian community in South Africa, do you typically prefer to converse in Amharic,
Oh
or
no,
do
I
you?
definitely did not find that. I can tell if someone's Ethiopian from the way they look, obviously. But let's say if it's stranger, I usually, is everything okay?
No, everything is fine. I think what I'm just going to do is we may edit this later.
Okay.
Yes, so maybe one question I have now is when you interact with the Ethiopian community, do you prefer to speak in Amharic or do you default to English?
Well, I guess it depends on, well, if it's someone that I know and I'm familiar with, I automatically speak in Amharic. But if it's like a stranger and I can tell that they're Ethiopian, I usually first like speak in English just because that's what I'm mostly used to speaking when I'm outside of my house or in like a social setting. But so specifically with strangers in stores where I'm trying to purchase something or strangers like where I need their assistance with something, I'll speak to them in English. And when I notice that they're somewhat standoffish, I will just convert to Amharic.
Mhm.
And I noticed that there's immediately like this change in their eyes. So I do sometimes use like the language to my benefit in that
Yeah,
sense.
yeah, I can understand that. That's quite interesting actually. That's very interesting. So, um, but I mean, but this also actually ties into another thing. I mean, when after learning Amharic, did your sense of being Ethiopian vis-a-vis your South African peers increase? Or and this also ties into maybe another question. So this is sort of a two-parter. Uh, were you always aware that you were different from other South Africans? And how kind of did that really structure the way you approached your Ethiopian identity and the Amharic language?
Well, I guess the one thing that it did change was that it was always sort of it became like a constant reminder because I feel like it's easier to forget that I'm a part of like this entire other culture because I'm not constantly surrounded by it.
Yeah.
So it can be easy to forget it. And I feel like speaking in Amharic, even though I don't realize it on a daily basis, um I don't immediately realize it, it's sort of a reminder that, oh, I'm a part of this entire other culture. And I think I mean, when I was a kid, I didn't really. feel like I was different or anything, or my culture made me different. I think the one time that it did make me a bit, I realized that, oh, okay, there's a difference was, I forgot how old I was, but when I was a kid, there were these, I was in primary school, and there were these xenophobic attacks happening in South Africa. And I remember I went to class and it was a Monday morning, and someone like looked, a friend turned around and saw me and said, "Oh, hey, you're still alive." And that sort of like, I mean, obviously, like we were kids and so on, and she didn't really mean anything by it, but it just made me realize, oh, wow, okay. So after that, I feel like I did start paying attention and realizing that there is somewhat of a difference. And even though I was born here, and that's when, and I think when I was a teenager, that's when it started hitting more and I
Mhm.
started realizing it more.
Yes, that's very interesting. And now, after your experience of learning the language, um, is this something that you would encourage other Ethiopians to do as well? Other Ethiopian South Africans who don't speak Amharic and like you, as a child, only speak English. Would you encourage them to go on the same process?
Yes, most definitely. I mean, I think what I've noticed the most, I don't have that many Ethiopian friends that are around my age, but from the like interactions that I've had in the past, what I've noticed is that a lot of people cannot speak Amharic in this country. Like if they were born in this country, they can't really speak it. Like they can say if like kind of like how I was when I was a kid, they can say a few phrases and so on because their parents speak Amharic and their families and so on speak Amharic, but they don't, like they can be my age and they don't really know it or like fully, they aren't that fluent in it. And I feel like it's such an important part of your identity and where your family comes from. And I feel like if you ignore it and you just forget it, it disconnects you from an entire lineage, and it's like a trickle effect where it just continues. So, and the if you stop now, then your children and the next generation and so on are most likely get this entire like ancestral entire identity. So I would really encourage people like my age who were born in South Africa to learn Amharic and actually to learn more about their history because it's a pretty amazing one. So
Yeah, very, very interesting history. Which is one of the reasons when you mentioned that you speak Amharic, I was like, I have to have her on the channel as soon as possible. Um, yeah, so that's super interesting. So would you also say that maybe, I mean, you're studying now at university, and one of the things that I find universal amongst all students of foreign languages, anyone who's come to a degree of fluency in their target language, uh, there's a there's actually quite a profound cognitive shift. There's a way it actually changes the way you think and improves the way you think in many
mhm.
ways. Do you find that that's the case with Amharic, and how exactly has it affected the way that you approach thinking about things?
I mean, I guess so. I mean, when you like read scientific journals and so on, they tell you that learning new languages increases your cognitive skills and whatnot. And I guess like in the moment, I never really realized that it could have possibly shifted, made a shift in the way I thought or my cognition skills and so on. But I guess now that I look back, it kind of did because when I look back, I noticed that there was definitely a significant change. I I don't think that I can really verbalize like how though.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that would be difficult because it's a sort of a tool that's become so incorporated into your own being now that it's not necessarily something that's
Yeah,
sufficiently
it's just
distant
become
from
second
you.
natures.
Yeah. Precisely. Well, that's been super interesting. I've really enjoyed having this interview. Um, I apologize somewhat for
Me
some of the
too.
connection issues, but I think everything that we wanted to say came
Uh,
across.
I'm
Um,
sorry too. I have a feeling that it might have been on my side, my end.
Who knows? Who knows? But many, many thanks for joining us and sharing your extremely interesting story. I honestly think maybe one day we could do a
Thank
part
you
two
for having
because
me.
it's a pleasure. I honestly think one day we could have a part two because it's been so interesting, and there are like I think maybe we've got through about maybe 10% of the questions that I actually came here with. Um, so
Definitely.
if you are keen on that, perhaps we can have a follow up one someday.
Definitely. Definitely. That sounds exciting. I'm excited. And
Excellent.
this was fun.
Yes, it was. It was a lot of fun for me as well. To all of our viewers, we say thank you very much. Maybe Ruth, you can say goodbye in Amharic to sign us off.
Well, actually, it's ciao, which is actually Italian.
Oh,
So,
so it must have come through the Italian influence in the 20th century.
yeah. Yeah. So, ciao.
Ciao. Okay, in that case, ciao and goodbye everyone, and we will see you in the next episode. Thank you very much.